A common question that historians have asked quite regularly is, was the Second World War a turning point for black Americans? Um, and this is a really interesting question because before World War Two, in the 1930s, we know that the situation for black people was particularly bad, especially in the South of the United States, when you had organizations like the KKK, you had the Jim Crow laws, there was the Great Migration in the 1930s, this massive migration of black people from the southern states to the northern states to get away from all of this stuff. So there's lots and lots of bad things happening in the 1930s. And then World War Two, which actually began in 1939 in Europe, started for America proper in December 1941 with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which brought America into World War Two. Now, for black Americans, this would present them with multiple opportunities. And the war, in terms of, the types of opportunities we're talking about, well, first of all, straight away, blacks joined the so-called Jim Crow Army. The so-called Jim Crow Army, made up of black people in the Air Force, in the Navy, and of course in the regular army as well. So lots of black people joined the forces, and when they joined the forces, their most common destination from 1942 onwards was Britain, which was on the front line of the war in Europe against Hitler. And that's where a lot of American soldiers, not just black soldiers, white and black American soldiers, were sent to train. When they got to Britain, their experience there was very, very different to what they'd experienced in the USA. This experience in Britain was probably the first time that a lot of these black Americans had experienced equality. So, for example, in Britain, they could flirt with white women in bars and not get beaten up. They could take white women out on dates. They lived much more equally. That's not to say there wasn't any racism in Britain at the time. Of course there was. But what there was legal equality, and nobody really made a big deal of the black people intermingling with white people. The people who made the biggest deal about it were the Americans themselves, who didn't like this at all. And in terms of their actual service in the army, they were trained in Britain. They had that really, really positive experience there. And then, the black regiments and battalions actually made a fantastic contribution to World War Two for America. And their contribution was felt in lots of different arenas. So, for example, you had the Tuskegee Airmen. The Tuskegee Airmen were a fighter squadron. They were pilots, and they were all black. It was an incredible fight for them to actually be able to have direct combat. But when they did get the direct combat they wanted, they acquitted themselves extremely well against the Germans, and they served with real quality in Italy against Nazi Germany, and made a real name for themselves. And then you had the 761st Tank Battalion. This was a battalion of black troops operating tanks, which was quite incredible if you think about the context of the USA at home at that time. And one of the most famous generals in the American Army, Patton, he was white. He called them the Black Panthers, which was sorry, not the Blank Panthers. I do apologise. Hang on a second. He called them the Black Panthers, and this was a name you'll see later on when you look at the civil rights movement. But in this case, it was a real complimentary nickname that was given to them because of their fearsome combat. And they saw service in Europe in 1944 into 1945, particularly at the Battle of the Bulge, which was the Battle of the Bulge, which was a major offensive by Hitler in Europe towards the end of World War Two, and the 761st Tank Battalion served really well during that conflict and became famous for their service during that conflict. So they've got their experience in Britain. They're having this contribution in the war, and this contribution in the war is leading to respect from white people, respect from politicians, respect even by 1945 from the president, who in 1945, after the death of Roosevelt in April 1945, Truman became president, and Truman was really impressed with the contribution of the blacks to the armed forces. It wasn't just their contribution abroad; it was also their contribution at home and their contribution to industry, to the huge arms manufacture that was going on in the United States from 1941 onwards. And by 1945, there were in fact 2 million black people working in munitions factories. 2 million black people working in munitions factories, and also a lot of black women working in these factories as well. So that's a huge contribution that they're making to the war effort. And again, that led to more respect. It caused more questions to be asked. Well, how can we rely on these 2 million black workers but also treat them so incredibly badly in the South and allow that to happen? That was a question for a lot of white people, who, particularly those that lived in the North. And because of this experience, a lot of black people moved to cities like Detroit. And in 1943, famously, there were riots in Detroit. But also there were other riots in places like New York and so on. In Detroit, in the riots in Detroit, and these were race riots. Let's be clear, they were riots between white and black people. Of course, it was really caused from this resentment from the whites about the arrival of all these black people into factories, but also the resentment of the blacks who were saying, you know, we're doing all this for the war as American citizens and we're getting nothing back. And that caused real clashes and real conflict between them. And in these particular riots in Detroit, people were killed. People were killed in those riots. And there were others in New York and other places as well. Now, ultimately, what happens after the war, after all of this? I'll just put a little heading up here. I mean, was it a turning point? Why do people see it as a turning point? Well, first of all, we talked about Truman over here, a president who was really impressed with what black people had done. In 1948, he made the army desegregated. That should probably say he desegregated the army, but that's okay. He made the army desegregated in 1948. And that was actually one of the first organizations in America to desegregate. When if you consider in the 1930s, the army was probably one of the most racist organizations in America. They were separating black battalions from white battalions at the start of World War II in their fight against Nazi Germany. So it was seen as very hypocritical, that. But now, after the war, 1948, you can see the progress that's being made because the army has been desegregated. I mean, yeah, we talk about this contribution in the war. They did have to fight for that because ultimately a lot of them worked as cooks, you know, on Navy vessels. A lot of black people had the worst jobs in the armed forces, especially to begin with. They were asked to load up ammunition casings, which was an incredibly dangerous job. It was one of the worst jobs going. So they had to prove themselves to get these opportunities in the first place, and Truman rewarded them in 1948 by desegregating the army. Not only that, NAACP membership. This is a group who were campaigning for black people. The NAACP membership went up from 50,000 people at the start of the war to 450,000 people by the end of the war, which is, you know, a huge influx of members. And a lot of those were middle-class blacks who now had decent jobs as a result of the Second World War. And really, a lot of people see this desegregation of the army leading to a push for desegregation in education, which we'll come on to in a later tutorials, and in transport, which we'll come on to. in the later tutorials. It really inspired black people to really go after the kind of change that they deserved.